Okay, greetings everyone. My clock says it is 12, or excuse me, 7 o'clock, so we'll go ahead and get started. The I-29 Moo University and Northern Plains Forage Association presents this webinar series monthly. And this evening, we have a variety of forage topics, including an overview of methods to determine hay supply needs, the decision process to decide if you should quit making hay, and a weather outlook. This webinar series is an extension of the annual Forage Field Day sponsored each summer by the I-29 Moo University and Northern Plains Forage Association, and that function is rotated amongst Iowa, Minnesota, Nebraska, and South Dakota. This webinar will be archived on the I-29 Moo University website, and it is at i-29moou.com. We have three 30-minute presentations followed by a question and answer session. You can add questions in the chat box at the bottom of the window, and if the presenters don't get them answered, then we will have a Q&A session at the end of the program. We're going to start today's program with Denise Schwab. She spent the past 42 years working for Iowa State University Extension, mostly doing the work of a beef specialist based in eastern Iowa. She earned her bachelor's degree in animal science at Iowa State University, as well as her master's. She will discuss calculating your forage needs, considering intake, factors, species, and body weights. As I always say, Denise, the podium is yours.
Well, thank you, Fred, for this opportunity to share with folks. And as you said, I'm probably coming at this from very much the beef world, but I'm trying to put in some other species as well to give you a few ideas to think about. So as we think about what are our forage needs, I always want to start with our inventory. So where are we at and what do we have on hand to be able to deal with? Try to get that inventory by field and by cutting, just the same as we would recommend that you do some forage sampling to make sure we are accounting for some of those differences. If you haven't already been able to get out and get some quality evaluations on your forages, now is probably not the best time, at least in the Midwest. We're a little deep in snow. But once we get a little bit of a thaw, get some of the snow melted away, the sooner you can get out and get those forage samples taken, the better. I also put in here to inventory our forages by location. And part of that is thinking in terms of it's probably easier to get the hay close to where we're going to be feeding it when the weather's nice and not have to depend on hauling a lot of hay on icy, snowy roads. But also, I threw this in here to say, think about how we place that hay into our storage units. Most of the time, first in is last out. And obviously, with a lot of our beef herds, the first cutting is the lowest quality. We want to use that up in the fall, early winter, before we get into the late gestation and early lactation. And if we only have one access into that building, we're using it just in the absolute backwards order of what we wanted. So thinking about if we've got some hay storage facilities, having access on both ends so we can use that lower quality forage earlier in the season. Then when we start to think about how much forage do we really need, intake is very varied based on a lot of factors. The most obvious and the one we always start with is body weight. And you know how sometimes you'll learn something early in your career and it just sticks with you forever. Well, my topic or point that I always remember from little on is 2.25 to 2.5% of their body weight in dry matter intake per day is a pretty darn good rule of thumb. And if you could just remember one number, that's the number I'm going to remember is 2.5%. Now we know age makes a difference. Younger animals are going to eat more in terms of percent body weight than older animals. They just are a little different in how they consume feed. But age is a bit of a factor. The biggest factor that we deal with, at least in the beef world, is stage of production. So we know as those cows move from first to second to third trimester of gestation, their nutrient requirements are going up. At the same time, that fetus is growing and taking up more of that body cavity. And so their intake potential actually is going down a little bit because there just isn't as much room for that rumen to fill up. So take that into account. And then also, as we move into lactation, we get rid of that fetus. And so we can start to have a bigger gut fill on those cows. Their intake may go up a little, but it also has to because their nutrient requirements. Weather has an impact on intake. We know that livestock can sense when that storm front's coming in, kind of try to fill up a little bit extra ahead of a windstorm or a snowstorm or a rain front, so that they have some extra energy in their system to get them through that storm front. Probably not going to eat very well through the storm. And then after the storm, they're going to want to really kind of hit the feed bunks hard again. On mostly forage diets, that's not much of a problem. It's probably okay to let them do that. On grain-based diets, high grain diets, that could be an issue, so that we got to watch that one. I threw in digestive system here just to account for most of the animals that are going to be consuming forages are ruminants, but we do have a few that are single stomach hindgut fermenters like horses. And so if you're either a crazy horse lady like me, or you use horses in your production system, they don't quite eat as much on a body weight basis. And then the last one I put up here is forage quality, and lots of aspects to that. One being, we know the higher quality, the cows are going to be able to eat more. It's going to be a high digestible fiber. It's going to be low fiber kind of a diet. And so they can consume a little more than a high fiber diet. Type I put in here, just thinking about if we're feeding long stem hay versus chopped hay. Long stem hay, they're not going to be able to eat quite as much as if we chop it and make that particle a little smaller. Also allows for a little faster passage rate when we pre-chop it, more surface area there for the microbes to take advantage of. And then from a moisture standpoint, when we start stacking high moisture forages on top of each other, so let's say we have a haylage, we have rilage, and we have corn silage. When you put that many wet feeds together, we just get a lot of water in the system. And so we don't have quite as much capacity for feed because we have so much moisture in it. So all things that might impact that. Looking a little bit at some species differences. Beef cattle, again, that 2.5% is a pretty good ballpark. Dairy cattle, some of the research will say 2 to 4% of their body weight in dry matter intake. And I think there's a couple factors for that. One, we bred dairy cows for decades to eat more in order to milk more, produce more milk. And we know that's kind of produced a cow with a lot bigger digestive system. We see that on our Holstein steers as well. A higher percent of that animal is gut capacity, and so they can eat a little bit more. The dairymen actually, when I think about nutrition, I often say beef cows are the couch potatoes of the bovine world. Dairy cows are the elite athletes. And so we've gotten a somewhat different philosophy in that ration balancing process, with the dairy cows being able to consume a little more, but also the dairy industry has actually gone from just percent body weight to using NDF or fiber in that calculation. So a lot of our dairy might be using more like 1 to 1.2% of body weight in NDF intake per day. So they've kind of fine-tuned that. When we look at our small ruminants, again, our dairy goats are kind of the elite athletes here, and our meat goats and sheep are our couch potatoes, but they do eat a little bit more or have the ability to eat more forage on a dry basis than beef cattle do. And then our hindgut fermenters, our horses, are going to be a little bit lower because they're the hindgut instead of the ruminants. So when it comes to calculating forage, it's just a simple math program, although it takes a little work. You can either do this on, the old pencil and paper method or put it into a simple spreadsheet. But basically, we're looking at the body weight of the animal as our starting point, and use as good a numbers as you can get. I would say don't underestimate the weight of your animals or the weight of your cows in this process because we need a little bit of cushion in here. But body weight times our percent intake times the days of the feeding period. So are we feeding, from January 1st to April 1st, or are we feeding from November to May? And then multiply it by our number of animals, divide it by forage matter, and that's going to give us how much feed we need. So, in a simple calculation here, or a simple example, 1,400-pound beef cows at 2.5% intake for 120 days of feeding period. And if I have 50 cows in my herd and my forage is 85% dry matter, I need about 247,000 pounds of feed. I would do this for every group of animals that I'm feeding. So I'm using mature cows here. We would also do this, another line for our bulls, a line for our bred heifers, a line for our first and second calf heifers, all the way through. In this example, I added in 30 ewes and said they're 150-pound ewes. They're going to eat 3% of their intake, 150 days, a little bit better hay, a little drier hay. And so you can see what I need there in terms of total feed. Now, this is what you need to get into the cows. And not everything we take off of the field ends up in the cow. So we need to make sure that we're figuring some waste into this calculation. If not, we're going to be underfeeding our animals. And as we look at that, there's oodles of studies that look at storage losses. We know that you put 100 tons of hay in the barn, you're not going to pull 100 tons out. So we know in the best case situation, we're still looking at about a 5% loss from storing it inside. So clear over to the right side. Clear over to the left side, if we're storing it outside, bare ground, no cover on the top, on average, we're at about 27% waste. But look up and down this column. We see as high as 50 and 60% loss when we store that feed outside on bare ground with no cover on it. So we need to account for some of that storage loss. If we're in between, if we've got it maybe covered over the top, I'm going to guess around 15%. But those are kind of my guidelines. 5% in a building, 15% outside but covered, 30% outside and on the bare ground with no cover on it. So account for that. We've seen some work, and I included this study just because I think it did a nice job. It was from, I believe it was Wisconsin and North Dakota that worked together on this study. But they looked at twine, net wrap, and bee wrap, the new bee wrap, that was stored for 12 months outside on pallets, so it's off the ground, but had no other cover on it. And actually, they had very little loss in this storing it outside. I think it was a fairly dry year they did this. But that bee wrap tends to look like it does a pretty good job of stopping moisture from getting down into that hay bale and significantly reducing the loss that way. So we account for storage loss. We also got to account for feeding loss. Not such an issue in the dairy world since you're mostly bunk fed or push up feeders. In the beef world, it can be a difference. And I would say not all feeders are designed the same. So this was a study done in Michigan several years ago, but they looked at round bale feeders, either just the straight ring or the ring with a cone inside. The two of those averaged about 5% loss, but you can see with that cone inside, they were down below 5%. Think about as that cow takes a mouthful of hay and pulls it out of that bale. In the cone feeder, it's going to drop down where the cow can get access to it. In the ring feeder, she's going to pull it out and probably stomp on it. And then the other two feeders, again, lots more loss, but in that 15% range. So as we think about feed loss, a bale ring, 8 to 15%, depending on whether it's got that inside rack. And that's assuming that we consume, the cows consume that hay in 1 to 2 days. The longer we expect that bale to last, the more waste we're going to have. We're feeding them out on the ground. So think about maybe unrolling a bale. If we do it every day, somewhere around 15% loss. If we do it multiple days, that goes up in a hurry. And then if we're grinding or processing, If we're feeding it in a bunk of some kind, so we're controlling where that feed is delivered to and what access the cows have to that, again, very low losses there. Versus if we're just grinding it, putting it on the ground, our losses tend to go up pretty quickly. So in a best case scenario, we're probably looking at about 10%, 5% feed loss, 5% or storage loss, 5% feeding loss. In a worst case scenario, we're getting up in that 30, 40, 50% pretty quickly. We need to add that on to what we said our requirements were. One of the next step I want to talk about then is allocating based on quality. And so this is not a hard set numbers, but just showing you kind of the scale from that lower 100 relative feed quality up to the higher 150. Common sense, our early lactation beef cows, our beef calves, our early lactation dairy cows, they need the highest quality forage. It's the most digestible, has the highest energy value, the lowest fiber value. That's what they need. Our heifers and dairy cows in late lactation, a little bit less again on the ewes. We go over to the left-hand side. We got our lactating beef cow, our developing beef heifers. They need kind of that middle quality hay and drop clear down to that dry cow that can use that low quality. So when we look at allocating this, that's again where I want to say that first cutting hay, at least in the beef world, is typically much lower quality than in the dairy world. We need to have that hay going into those dry cows, those post weaning cows that are in second trimester, and saving their good, better quality hay for the developing animals and lactating cows. And then my last point is plan on some cushion. So we've got to have some carryover. Looking at the last 3 to 4 years, a lot of this Midwestern area in cow country, we've used up every ounce of old carryover hay we had because we're in dry conditions. And so we kind of need to rebuild that stockpile or stored hay to utilize for future droughts. How much you need to plan is very much dependent on each individual operation. I would say 20-25% carryover is probably not a bad starting point. But again, it depends on your comfort with risk. How hard are you pushing your forage needs or your cows in that situation? What other alternatives do you have? Whatever we do plan to carry over, we want to make sure is stored inside or at least is protected from the elements, both wicking up into the bale from the ground and moisture coming down from above. So make sure we have enough cushion as we're allocating our estimating our forage needs. So in summary, kind of my thoughts in terms of doing our inventory on forage needs is first look at our forage, get a good inventory on how much we have of each different type and quality, as well as the location of those feedstuffs. Second step is calculating what our cows need based on the number of animals we have, their body weights, and their stage of production. The next step would be looking, adding in that cushion for storage and feeding losses, and then allocating based on the animal requirements and the forage quality and factoring in some cushion or some extra excess in case we have a bad weather situation the following year. So with that, here's my contact information. I will monitor the chat and try to answer questions as I see them pop up there, or be on for questions at the end.
Thank you, Denise. We've actually got a couple of minutes here. If people have questions, we're a fairly small group this evening. Unmute and ask a question away. I'm going to start. We've had some recent hay storage fires. How do you deal, how do you determine this heat damage? You know, obviously, if it's charred black and crumbles, you can't feed it. But have you got a handle on this heat damage from fires?
Well, for one, I would make sure you're forage testing it so you get a better handle on it. Let the chemistry labs do that. I'd probably run wet chemistry instead of just NIR on those. The other thing is, you know, if you get just a little charring, you get that caramelizing effect. Cattle really like it, but we know it's burning up protein as it's doing that. So,
Yep.
yeah, I would say if you do have caramelized or um, heat damaged forages, we're going to try to limit that as much as we can in terms of the mix. We're not wanting that to be our main source of forage or being totally dependent on the nutrients out of that. Um, Blending it down where we can. Again, it depends on how bad it is. Um, but yeah, making sure if we're either making dry hay, or we're making wet baleage, but that never land between being too dry for baleage and too wet for hay, that's the danger zone. So we need to really be conscientious of that. In this part of the state, that's probably first cutting hay most likely because we have a hard time getting enough drying days at first cutting. But yeah, not an easy one on that one.
Yeah, I liked your first comment. Send it to a lab. That's the best way to know what you're feeding your cows. You implied some thoughts on storage, the difference in wraps and the difference in the tubes. Any thoughts on how fast storage structures can actually pay for themselves?
Um, I'm trying to think back. I do know we have a decision tool in our ISU Ag Decision Maker that looks at exactly that. How fast can you pay off a hay shed? What's the payout time period? Um, it also obviously depends a lot on what's our feed cost. So how high is alfalfa or good hay at that time? Um, I would say where we're at now, maybe we'll hear better on prices later in today's program, but it's going to take a little while to pay it off at this rate. We get back to where hay's 150, 200, 250 bucks a ton. It's going to pay out a lot faster. Um, I honestly think the plastic wrap does a really pretty good job of protecting that hay without the big upfront cost. It might not be more economical long term because you have that cost year after year after year. But in the short term, that's probably a decent option. The other is, and I have not seen if it's available right now, but I know in the last few years we've been able to get some cost share through, I believe I don't think it's Equip, but it's through NRCS on commodity storage buildings or commodity storage units, and hay is considered a commodity. So we can get some cost share on the building structures for hay storage. And if you qualify, I darn sure would make sure I check with NRCS and FSA and see if that's a possibility to help cover some of that cost.
Absolutely. And that's, if memory serves, that's a fairly new addition to their
Mhm.
program. So, yeah, something worth looking into. Uh, because I know we have small ruminant folks who are going to be viewing this concerning quality, the gestation consumption, because they're built different than our cows are. They get twins and triplets in there. We've got to really be conscious of high quality going into those performance does and ewes. Am I misrepresenting that or?
No, I agree. And I guess that's one thing I forgot to mention too when I was looking at the percent of intake. You're right that when you just get that body cavity full of fetuses, especially multiples, they don't have the gut space to be able to put as much forage through it. However, our small ruminants also have that mouth that's very can be very selective, and you feed those girls very stemmy alfalfa, you have all the stems behind and they eat all the leaves, right? And so we kind of need to keep that into account as well. Irritating as heck when you think they should clean that up, but they just won't. They'll eat all the goodies off it and leave the stems behind. And that's part of the beef cow part of me says that's waste, doggone it, sheep eat it. The sheep mom in me says, well, they're getting the best of the best, and so actually their ration is probably a little higher quality than we're accounting for because they are being very, very selective and getting those leaves that are low in fiber, very highly digestible, high nutrient content. So they're getting
Yep,
some benefits that way. Yep.
exactly. Okay, I'm not seeing any questions in the chat. If anybody has a question they want to just unmute, I'll hold off for a second. I will ask Carson if you want to go ahead and uh, load your slide deck up. We'll be ready to go.
So Denise, excuse me, what's your suggestion? We got a lot of rain that got a lot of hay that got a lot of rain on. Maybe it's a little bit moldy or might have, you test it. How do you deal with that? Because I think good quality hay, dairy quality hay is, I mean, not expensive by historical standards, but expensive compared to other hays. Do you have any brilliant suggestions how to make that all work?
I do believe you've stumped her, Jim.
But it says my internet is unstable, so maybe I'm unstable too. Um, so what I would say is from a mold standpoint, um, I would probably try to allocate most of that hay that's got any kind of discoloration or mold to our lowest requirement animals. So I'm going to try to shift as much of that as I can to my finishing steers. They're on a low fiber diet, so they don't need very much of it. Probably go to my mid gestation animals to try to use some of that up, and then I'm going to blend it down as much as I can. So again, having a good inventory, how much of do you have, and then I'm going to blend it as much as I possibly can. A lot of times, those molds that we see in hay, not all the time, but a lot of times they're not mycotoxin producing molds, especially if we see them. Now they can be, but not frequently. But the dust that comes with it and the palatability issues and the fact that some of that mold is again consuming some of the nutrients on that hay is going to lower the quality on it. So it's hard when you have a lot of it. But I'm just going to try to allocate it to those animals that need the least quality and then dilute for the rest. Does that help?
So I think, I mean, I don't know if there is a right answer. I think that's why it's so hard to wait. It's one of those things there, there's no right answer. You do the best you can, right?
Right.
Exactly.
And if
Thank
you have the ability to have some excess quantity as you're doing your allocation or your planning, you have excess, at least then you can let them waste a little, let them lay on it.
Yeah.
You've got some other high quality feeds that you can replace it with. So, again, having some of that cushion and carryover is going to make that job a little easier.
No, I think that's a really good point is don't force them to eat it up when you got plenty of hay because they'll sort out the bad stuff, right? Part of it isn't
Yep.
perfect, but I think that's a really good point is allow them to waste a bunch of it.
Yeah, it's basically going to be bedding, but
Yeah, exactly.
Yep. Thank you, Denise. Appreciate it. Dr. Roberts, if you want to go ahead and share your screen and load your slide deck, I'll make the introduction. Our next presenter is Dr. Carson Roberts. He's an assistant professor and state extension specialist for forage agronomy at the University of Missouri. Dr. Roberts holds a PhD in plant and soil science from Mississippi State University. He leads an applied research program in forage livestock systems to support one of the largest beef herds in the U.S. He has a particular interest in regenerative systems that improve drought resiliency. His presentation will suggest 4 alternatives that could be more economical than growing hay for your animals. Dr. Roberts, the podium is yours.
Thank you. And I'm pretty excited to be here. As was just said, my name is Carson Roberts. And so before I jump into the four ways that we can more economically go about, I guess, doing business than producing hay, I thought it'd be a really good opportunity to give I guess, a list of the reasons why we should be moving away from hay. And maybe that'll give us a little bit of an insight on where we should go from there. Um, and so let's see. There we go. To start out, if we look at the profitability of a beef production herd, there's a wide array of what producers are capable of as far as profitability goes. And typically in the past, it has been the case that we have some producers that lose money, usually about $200 per cow, and then the top tier producers that make money about $200 per cow, and then the average producer falls somewhere in the $0 per cow range. And so there have been a lot of studies in the past that have gone to looking at why there is this variability in what people are making in the beef industry. And when we look at this, a lot of the industry is focused on weaning weight, but this research showed that only 2.4% of the variability in profitability is due to calf weight, which is kind of counterintuitive to what a lot of people think, where we're expecting that these big calf weights are what is driving profitability. But the number one thing that we've found is that feed cost is what's driving the the profitability, where the people who are making the most money are spending the least on their forages. This study was done multiple times at a few different universities or through a few different states. And so here's another example where, again, calf weight is explaining 4% of the variability and profitability, and feed cost is explaining a bulk majority of the profitability that these producers are making. I'd also like to note that herd size, if you look down at the bottom of this list, herd size makes up about 0.7% of the variability in profitability, which really tells you that it really doesn't matter what size the herd is. Small herds can be profitable and large herds can be profitable. So this situation has really, I guess, pushed me to evaluate where do we go from here? What part of the feed cost budget needs to be fixed? And so really what it boils down to is the stored forage cost, and the cost of stored forages is quite high. So I've lived in a number of different places during my adult life, and I've lived in Mississippi and lived in Missouri, and I lived near Minnesota on the Minnesota South Dakota border there. And one thing that all of these three states have in common is that they all unroll hay for about 130 days of the year. And this is across, usually the folks in the north are blaming their snow on the reason why they feed so much hay. Usually the people, in like Mississippi are saying that they don't have the quality of the forage that they need to feed hay. And the Missouri folks, I don't know exactly what their excuse, because stockpiled fescue is such a fantastic resource, but there you have it. Anyway, and so diving into this, I've really, I guess, taken away 10 key reasons why what why we could go away from making hay and maybe make more money, especially in the cow calf business. And so we'll go off with some of these. The first one is skyrocketing equipment costs. And a lot of our infrastructure for producing hay and feeding hay was established, 50 years ago, 60 years ago. But there are some key differences between what is happening today and what is happening in the past that maybe make it no longer viable to be producing your own hay. Um, and so if you look at this, 50 years ago, the top of the cattle market, you could sell 14 calves thereabouts and buy yourself a brand new round baler. And now in today's market, if you take another 500-pound calf and you try to sell a bunch of those to buy a round baler, you would have to sell 27 calves to afford the same or to afford a brand new round baler. So our equipment costs have outpaced our calf prices in a regular year about 10 to 1, which is a pretty staggering number, that our costs are going up that much. And so if we're not doing some things at scale, then it can be quite costly for us. Another, okay, here's some more on that same subject. An argument that I often hear about is that, okay, well, none of us are buying used equipment, and that's a fair argument. But even if you look at used equipment, and if you're an average hay producer, and average hay producers in the United States are making about 80 acres of hay, it differs from state to state. That my home state of Idaho average is about 120 acres, and here in Missouri the average is 72. So anyway, if you just took a basic line of equipment, and I went shopping for equipment, and I found some good used equipment that I could string together for to make some hay with, just the bare minimum. And if you look at all these pieces of equipment and add it all up, you get about $57,000 tied up in equipment, and your machinery ownership per acre is right around $42 an acre per year. Um, and so that's contributing a lot to the issues around the cost of making hay. Another issue is over-equipped farms, and the way I like to explain this is go and walk around your farm and take pictures of all of the different pieces of equipment that you have that are dedicated towards making hay mainly. And I did the same thing here at the research farm here at the Cornett farm. It's a working farm. Not a ton of research that goes on here, by and large. Make about 100 acres of hay. And so some of this is extravagant because it is the university and they get some sweetheart deals on some of the equipment, but just knock 10 years off of all this equipment and you might have the same thing on a regular farm. I know that the farm I grew up on had kind of a similar situation here. So we have a tractor here hooked to a mower conditioner, um, and and then, oh, okay, here's a rake and it's hooked to a tractor as well. And then we have a baler. So now we have three different tractors and three different pieces of equipment. And we also have a tractor to pick up the bales and haul them off the field. Have a bale trailer, a couple other balers that may or may not work. I know that one of those works. I don't know about the other one. Another swather maybe. Another baler, that one works as well. And another trailer that we can use to haul hay. And so when we add all this up, this is not just the bare minimum anymore. This is a lot more stuff than what we, originally intended on using for making hay. And it all goes and it all contributes to the cost of the enterprise. Oh, and here's another hay trailer that we have in the weeds. So if we look at this and if you add another tractor, so you have a couple tractors, you have a used mower, conditioner, a rake, a baler, a truck, and a trailer, and you try to make that cost work over, the average in Missouri is 72 acres. Your cost per ton is right around $100 a ton to make hay. And in Missouri, where we make a lot of fairly low quality hay, that really doesn't pencil very well. And so there's a few things that you can do to spread the cost of that equipment out over more acres. Um, And I think this is one of my points that I want to get at with this whole thing is that you need to be producing at scale um, in order to make all this work. Because even with the simple number of equipment, two tractors and just the bare minimum for equipment, that costs add up quite readily. So if we bump this up to 500 acres and look at our costs, then our costs are still right there at $80 per ton. Um, and then let's look at another situation. Let's say we increase our yield. And if we increase our yield, it actually does a whole lot more for us than would increasing our acreage. If we bumped up to 500 acres, it doesn't do, too much for us. But if we increase our yield, it sure does a lot in how much we can spread the cost of that equipment out. And that's mainly because the haying enterprise is a cost on a per acre basis. Really, it doesn't matter whether you're making 1 ton per acre hay or 10 tons per acre hay. The costs are relatively similar. There's not a whole lot. Maybe you're spending more on net wrap, but the fuel, the equipment depreciation really doesn't change a whole lot. Um, and when I get further into this, talking about drought, when you have a drought and your yields are low, let's bump those yields down so that you're making 2 tons per acre, maybe in a drought year. Your costs per ton skyrocket because you're spreading all of the cost of that equipment, the labor, the fertilizer, everything over much fewer bales of hay essentially. And so it increases your cost. Um, all right, my reason number three is what could you do with your time if you weren't making hay? And this is a fun one if you just think about it, all of those things that you could do, maybe, early to mid-summer that you couldn't do otherwise. And one that I often recommend is to develop fence and water so that you can graze more efficiently. Maybe improve your grazing management so that you can extend your season, utilize forage more efficiently, all of that stuff. You could spend that time shopping for some high quality hay for winter feeding. If you weren't making hay, you might need some hay in the wintertime anyhow. So you could spend that time shopping around and finding a good deal on some high quality hay. Um, Marketing, yeah, you could find ways to improve your revenue through marketing your farm products a little better. Shopping around for better prices on inputs like minerals. There's a lot of things that you can do there to improve your costs or reduce your cost of production. Attending educational workshops and all those stuff. There's tons of field days that go on in the summertime. Are you missing those? You might gain something from those that could improve your profitability on your operation. And then the one that speaks to me the most is spending time with family. I can't tell you how many times we missed out on a lot of family reunions during the summertime because, we were busy making hay. And spending time with family is by far the most valuable time I spend in my day. So, um, number four, labor shortages. We can't find good help nowadays. Good help is hard to find, and help is quite expensive. And what I've found is that we're no longer competing with other farms per se for our help. We're now competing with a number of local businesses and non-local businesses for our young farm labor. And it's no fault to the young person that wants to make a decent wage because they go and they look at what they could make out working outside on a farm, in the heat over time, all of that stuff, and versus what they can make in one of these major establishments. And suddenly you can realize maybe why they would choose to work there instead of a farm. And so that's something that we need to recognize, because there's a lot of fantastic young, hardworking people, but um, they need to be able to find value in working on a farm rather than working, at a local establishment. Okay, oversupply of hay, and I might spend a little time on this one because I think that the information here is valuable. This year we've had a huge glut of hay and maybe not the highest quality, but we have a ton of hay on the market and it's pretty cheap. And you can buy hay, especially this year, for less than you could make hay by yourself. And of course, this is year dependent. This does not always happen, but certainly in this year, if we go back to our costs per ton compared to the costs, if you look at the local market, what you can buy hay for, I think that you'd be relatively surprised. But it's not always like that. So if we go back and I've went all the way back to 2017 in some of this data looking at our mixed grass hay prices, and you can see that where we are right now, we're at a pretty low point in the hay market, but it's not always that way. In fact, the past couple of years we've had a pretty expensive hay market. Um, and across the different forage quality perspectives. And but if we're right here, if you average all this out, though, you and find your mean, and that's where you should be shooting, if you're trying to decide whether you should make hay or whether you should buy hay or a mix of both or whatever is average out the cost of making hay over several, or the value of the hay over several years, and see how well you're measuring up. And I always look at the fair hay price because that's what most people in Missouri are making, fair hay. There's not a ton of good or premium hay that's produced in this state, so I typically look at the fair price and go from there, especially for our beef producers, because we can afford to feed fair hay, and dry pregnant cows during the wintertime don't need all that much nutrition. So um and so we looked at this, and there was this huge spike in the 2023s and 2024s in hay prices. And this is caused from basically from this drought. And we concern ourselves a lot with drought, and I like to remind people that we have it really good compared to how it has been in the past, where those droughts in the 50s and 60s, where they didn't make or feed as nearly as much hay as we do now, and they survived through some terrible droughts with a lot more cows in the state than we do now. So that's interesting. Now, what I did here is I predicted the yield of the hay and the cost of the hay, per year, and so that I could get a value per acre, because typically our fair hay is usually higher yielding because it's more mature forage, and our premium hay is a younger plant, so you typically produce less. And so you can see that on average, all of these kind of perform about the same as far as cost per acre goes until you hit one of these drought events. And then things get a little interesting. And so we hit a grass shortage, and the hay costs kind of spike. And then we hit an overabundance of grass, and the price just floors out essentially. And like I mentioned earlier, there's this relationship between yield and quality where our vegetative forage is going to be a lot higher quality, but we're going to produce our most yield um, at the detriment of quality as maturity increases. So if we zoom in on this hump, um, you can find that during the low supply, high demand, you'll probably make more money in producing hay if you just produce a lot of fair quality hay, because the market is going to reward you for having hay regardless of quality, really. Um, but in these high supply, low demand situations like what we're in now, oftentimes it's more profitable to produce our good to premium quality hays, because in those situations there's usually a lot of hay on the market, but there's not that, but a lot of it is junk, and there's not a lot of high quality hay. And so depending on where you are in the market is really, maybe what you want to do as far as, buying hay or producing hay, how you want to manage quality in those situations. That leads me to variable number 5 here. And it's the, forage or producing hay can be variable from year to year and from cutting to cutting, and depending on if your crop gets rained on, all of this stuff just plays factors. And if you look at this picture on the right here, we've all been in this situation, and it's kind of a gut wrenching feeling when you see all of that hay sitting in the windrow. And you just keep receiving these rainstorms after rainstorms, and you're not able to put up the hay, and it ends up being low quality. And you really can't control that. That's kind of out of your control. But what is in your control is when you're purchasing hay, you can choose whether you're purchasing high quality hay or low quality hay. You really can't always get that certainty when you're making the hay yourself. Um, and to point this out, if we look at when we're making hay, we're usually making it during a time of the year where our ability to predict the weather is the lowest. So we're seeing a lot more variability in weather patterns, and our weathermen aren't able to predict it as accurately as they would during other times of the year. Oftentimes, I love making hay in May just because you can predict the weather patterns pretty easily. So, reason number 7, haying removes nutrients, and this is a big reason for me. I love messing with soil fertility, and haying, they when you remove all of that above ground biomass, you're removing all of the nutrients that goes with it, and it's being taken off the field and typically never being put back. So if we look at the average bale of fescue hay, there's about $72 of nutrients inside a ton of that fescue hay. And if you want to think about a higher quality forage like alfalfa, that's 18% protein, you can add another $15 to $20 in nutrients that are inside that hay bale. And another thing here is, as your hay quality increases, the percentage of nutrients inside the bale increases as well. And I have that pictured, here with our dry matter digestibility compared to our phosphorus content or our potassium. And you can find that there is a relationship where our higher quality forages often have more nutrients in them. Soil degradation, compaction is a big deal. You usually have a lot of heavy equipment uh, on the ground when you're making hay, and that causes a lot of compaction. One thing I'm really passionate about or interested in is there's low biomass return because you're removing all the biomass. Some of my work for my PhD went to show this, that when you return the biomass to the soil, this is spring biomass in the form of a cover crop, that you actually improve your season-long soil moisture as you increase the amount of biomass you're returning to the soil. And that is not a function of soil carbon, but it is a function of good aggregation in the soil, because the better those aggregates are formed, the better that they can hold water. and more water equals more yield and a lot more stuff that can happen. So aggregation, it's essential for good infiltration, and if you're not returning some biomass to the soil, it's really hard to get that aggregation. I mean, here's a very low biomass soil, and if you look just and these pictures were taken literally feet apart, um, you can get that aggregation when you're returning the biomass to the soil when you have roots in the soil. And this is because of this decomposition that occurs where you have this dead thatch and this decomposition zone, and it really creates an active site for all of those microbes in the soil. Profitable alternatives. Haying. I've done a bunch of research on haying versus grazing here at the research farm, and this year particularly, this is the results from this year that our haying enterprise had negative net returns, and maybe that's expected because hay prices are so low. But again, our grazing had positive net returns, and our grazing enterprise responded a lot better to our management, in this case, nitrogen rate, that we were able to improve profitability a lot better or take advantage of a lot more of our resources by grazing than we did by haying. And then, all right, so here we get into I guess the four ways that we can, that we can get away from making hay and do something different. And the first one that I really love to talk about is grazing milo. We can plant a crop of milo, treat it like a grain crop, and then harvest it as forage during the winter time. Basically, what these cows are doing is eating the grain head of the milo. So you're essentially rationing grain to the cows. Typically, you would have to move the cows every day so they don't eat all the grain in the first week. Um, and and that's a really great way to carry a lactating beef animal through the winter. Another way is stockpiled fescue. And if you live somewhere where you can grow stockpiled fescue, it's a fantastic resource. Again, low cost, and in any of these situations, you really don't have to start a tractor to feed your cows in each day. Corn stalks is another one. If you have access to corn stalks, that's a real cheap way to feed cattle as well. And then, if you compare all these to feeding hay is usually about twice the cost of these other options. So, what is the alternative to feeding hay? I have a few options here, and the first one is, a lot of people, when they think of the folks that aren't feeding hay, that usually means starvation, but that's not really what I'm talking about. Other people, transition to seasonal grazing, where it doesn't make sense to have animals out eating stockpile. And that's what I've done on my own place is we have a seasonal herd and they go somewhere else in the wintertime. And then we bring in new animals for the next grazing season. Stockpiled tall fescue. But when you start talking about stockpiling fescue, it takes a fair bit of management and forethought and planning, and drought management, stocking rates, all of that needs to be thought about. And then a few other stockpiling annuals, eating, end of season leftovers, taking advantage, when you talk about annuals, especially these warm season annuals like the Milo, you can take advantage of reliable precipitation in the early parts of summer and turn that into winter forage, which is something that you really can't do in a tall fescue situation. You're really depending on that fall time precip to carry you through the winter. And then crop residue and cover crops, especially as cover crops continue to be a bigger part of production systems, it's also a forage resource. One thing I wanted to mention here, especially because we do have a bit of snow on the ground now, um, is that stockpile fescue does not look like this. This is a field that we grazed this earlier this fall to about a 3 to 4 inch residual. And if you imagine a cow's mouth has just about the same capabilities as your hand, and that cow needs to eat 30 pounds of dry matter base on a dry matter basis. And so if you with your hand have a difficult time collecting some forage, then a cow's not going to want to go after that either. And so it's really hard to convince a cow to dig through the snow for just a meager amount of forage. But just a field over, here's a field that we have stockpiled, and um, and that forage is about 12 to 15 inches tall. And the cows will readily go after that because every time they dig through the snow to take a bite, they get a mouthful. And so they're more willing to go after that forage. So I think that that's something that a lot of people miss when they think about stockpiled forage, is that you can't expect them to dig through snow to eat nothing. There has to be something there for them to eat. And you can graze this type of stockpile, and the cows will be willing to dig through even 2 feet of snow to get to it, because they know when they get to the bottom that they'll have quite a bit of forage there to eat. So, I guess in conclusion, a couple ways to make haying more profitable. Increasing yield per cutting, that's the big one. If you can increase your yield somehow, that's one way that spreading your costs, out over more bales of hay, can make a lot of sense. Minimizing excess equipment, sell off the stuff that you don't use or that you don't use that often, or utilize custom haying, either having someone else coming onto your farm to custom do your stuff, or using your equipment to spread your equipment costs over more acres. And also some ways to make haying more sustainable. Manage field traffic. That's a big one. Manage the pH and the nutrients. Return the nutrients by feeding hay onto the hay fields. That's a really great way to return the nutrients. And then one thing that I really like is rotating hay fields, where you're grazing the fields, for most of the time, and then you cut hay, every once in 3 years or so. And in a lot of situations, that makes a lot of sense, because then you're not beating your hay fields to death, and you can rotate them around. So in conclusion, here's some of those 10 reasons why you would want to quit making hay. And I believe that's all that I have for you today. So I don't think that we have much time for questions. I don't know. I'll leave that to Fred, and yeah, we'll go from there.
I believe we've got some questions. We're going to go ahead and have you quit sharing and have Josh go ahead and load his presentation on, and then we'll do questions at the end of the program. Traditionally, we do a uh, outlook on prices. But this time of the year, I think the outlook made sense to do climate and weather. So our final speaker today is Josh Bendorf. He's a climate outreach specialist with Wisconsin State Climatology Office based at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. He held this position since March of 2025. Prior to this time at SCO, Josh worked for Pheasants Forever and the USDA Midwest Climate Hub. Josh holds a BS degree from UW-Madison and an MS degree from Iowa State University. Josh's interest in weather and climate comes from his upbringing on a small dairy and cash crop farm in southwestern Wisconsin. He will offer his insights on the 2025 growing season with an early look at the 2026 weather. Josh, the podium is yours.
All right. Thank you so much, friend. And yeah, I don't have anything to add to Fred's introduction other than I'll just say again, my name is Josh Bendorf with the Wisconsin State Climatology Office. Happy to be here talking to dairy farmers tonight. Like Fred said, I am a dairy farm kid myself, so always love the opportunity to get to talk to dairy farmers about the weather. So first in my presentation tonight, I just want to, like I said, I want to give a recap of the 2025 growing season first before I get into some of the outlooks for this upcoming winter and then some of the early looks at what we could be on tap for this spring. First, though, I want to give a recap of the drought and precipitation that we had during the spring and summer months. So if we take a look at these two maps, the map on the left shows the United States Drought Monitor drought intensity map from April 1st of this past year, and then comparing that to where we are now. This is the most recent map that came out this week, December 2nd. You can see the intensity scale on the upper right of the slide. Those areas in white are no drought, abnormally dry, D0. Those areas in yellow, not technically drought, but kind of heading in that direction. And then D1 through D4 are different levels of drought. So if we take a look at that map on April 1st, we see a lot of our drought was kind of located more on the western side of the north central region in some of the high plains states. So we see there in the Dakotas through western Minnesota, northwestern Iowa, we had a lot of D1 drought, moderate drought. Those areas in darker orange, those are areas in severe drought, and then some instances of extreme drought on the far western fringes of this area. And then the more you went to the east, the less likely you were to be in drought during this time. But if we take a look at where we are several months later, now in December, things have kind of flip-flopped a little bit. A lot of those areas out in the high plains and in the I-29 corridor are now out of drought or in that D0 category, with just a few patchy areas of D1 drought left. But now a lot of our drought is more on the eastern side of the Mississippi River, including where I'm based here in Wisconsin, where we've had some drought develop just this fall. And we'll talk a little bit more about why that's been the case. So here's just another way to display drought. I've picked 3 states out of the I-29 corridor, South Dakota, Minnesota, and Iowa. These are time series plots of drought monitor coverage. Going back to 2000, the drought monitor has been in operation since 2000. So you can see how drought has changed over time periods where we've been in pretty bad drought. But the area that I've boxed off on these 3 charts is just the year 2025. So you can get a sense as to how things have changed over time throughout the year. And we can see in all 3 of these states, we started out with a fair amount of each one of these states in drought coverage. In the case of South Dakota, pretty much the whole state in D1 drought or higher, with things kind of tapering off as we got into the spring months, a little bit of a lull there, probably late summer, early fall, with a little bit of a spike in the fall months leading up to the winter. So why was that the case? So we set the stage with, we had that drought out in the west, kind of the western side of our region, as we were heading into the first part of the growing season. What was the precip situation like this spring and during the summer months? I'm not going to get into what each individual month was like. We don't really have time for that tonight. So I'm going to kind of lump everything together into spring and summer. And what we're seeing here, this map from the Iowa Environmental Mesonet, this is taking a look at climate divisions. So these subsets of counties by state. And what we're looking at is between the months of April through the end of August, looking at that precip that we had in 2025 and comparing that total to our whole period of record, 1893 through 2025, that 133 years. How does 2025 stack up compared to those other years? What we see across a lot of the region, especially in the Dakotas, parts of northern Iowa, western Minnesota, is that this period was one of the top 10, or even in some cases, top 5 wettest on record. That 5-month period compared to that same period in other years, this is one of our wettest on record. So a lot of shots of rain in this area. Pretty much was kind of the name of the game across most of the region. We see a lot of these divisions showing up here, top 10, top 20 wettest of all time. What that meant for the drought monitor over the spring and summer months is a lot of reduction in drought intensity. You can see those areas that were pretty wet in the high plains and parts of the western Midwest improved a lot in drought over this time. And in some cases, those areas like D2 and D3 were eliminated because of how wet it was. So that's looking a little bit further back. Now let's look more at more recent conditions. So things since August, pretty much focusing on the fall months. This is precipitation over the last 90 days. Both you see on the left, the amount of precipitation that we've had between September 5th and December 3rd. And then that same time period, but looking at how that precip compares to normal. So when we're talking about normal, we're talking about what we would expect to see over the 30-year average, 1991 to 2020, our most recent 30-year climate period. And so what we see, we had a very wet April through August, but come fall, things really switched. And what we saw was across a lot of the region, you see a lot of this map here on the right is showing up in those orange and red colors. Those are areas that had below normal precip for that 90-day period. In some cases, 50% or less of average precipitation, just in some of those areas that were just coming off of one of their top 10 wettest April through August periods on record. So a complete flip-flop from what we saw earlier in the season. And just for context, those totals in those areas were anywhere from that ballpark of 2 to 4 inches. Areas that are in the yellow shading on that map on the left, 4 to 6 inches. With some isolated pockets in here, like in Iowa and eastern parts of the Dakotas that were nearer to normal, more above normal the further west that you got. So zooming in now to the last 30 days, pretty much the month of November. Similar situation, maybe not as below normal as we were if we looked at the full 90 days. Still a lot of orange on this map. So again, areas that are like 75% or less of normal compared to the average that we would expect. And then what that total precipitation, some areas we see here in the darker orange and the red are areas during the month of November had less than an inch of precipitation. So again, a continuation of what had been a very dry fall for most, with some areas here in northern Iowa and especially into eastern parts of South Dakota that got a little bit of relief, as well as parts of northern Missouri that got a little bit of relief from that dryness. Turning now to temperatures this past fall, everything from in the southern part of our region, middle to upper 50s, all the way up to the northern part of our region, which was about upper 40s to lower 50s. But pretty much wherever you were in the region, you were above normal. So below normal precipitation, above normal temperatures. And this was one of our warmest falls on record. I didn't include a map here of the climate divisions of temperatures, but this one ranked pretty high in terms of warm falls. And basically, no matter where you were kind of in that 2 to 4 or 4 to 6 degree range above normal temperatures. Last 30 days, month of November, again, pretty similar. Maybe the further east that you got, you were closer to normal for this time of year, like within a degree or 2 of normal. But then the further west that you got, you were more likely to be 2 or more degrees above normal. So what does this mean for soil moisture? So these are 2 soil moisture products that are satellite-based estimates of soil moisture. These are different than like in situ soil moisture measurements that we would have, for example, from a mesonet. These are estimates from satellites. So what we're seeing here, these are within roughly the top meter or so of soil. And what these maps are showing is how the moisture we have in our soil for this time of year compares to what we would expect to see for this time of year. So the more red these maps are, the more below what we would expect for this time of year. So we see these areas here where we had, like I said, we had pretty much a dry fall across the board, with some areas here in the Dakotas that did get some relief later in the fall. We see pretty much across the board. This map on the left is showing up as in those red and orange shadings. So areas that are well below normal soil moisture for what we would expect for early December. The signal's not as strong with the CPC model. There's some differences in how these models work. But again, we see those areas showing up as dry, kind of in the eastern half of the region, with that area in the Dakotas, indicating that that area might actually be a little bit wetter than normal. I do want to touch on snow because we've had some of it over the last few days. Map here on the left is showing the daily station snow depth from MRCC at Purdue. These are the measurements for the 24-hour period ending the morning of December 3rd. So a day or so old by this point, but with the cold temperatures we've had, I wouldn't have expected this to have changed very much. See anywhere, a lot of this is from that big system that we had come through late last week into the weekend. A lot here in those blue shadings, 4 to 6, 6 to 8 inches on the ground. I know here in southern Wisconsin, where I'm based, we had over a foot of snow on Saturday, and a lot of that has still stuck around with the unseasonably cold temperatures that we've had. And some areas here, you see in Iowa, where totals were even higher, that there's still like, in some cases, a foot or more still lingering around on the ground. And the question that you might be thinking is, well, is this something we would expect for this time of year? I think that's a pretty obvious question to answer. No, it's very much not what we would expect for this time of year. This is a pretty anomalous system. And as we can see on this map on the right, that shows how the accumulated snowfall since November 1st compares to normal. In some cases in Iowa and southern Wisconsin, we have instances of 3 to 4 times as much snow as we got this year as we would expect. A little bit less or so as you get up into Minnesota and North Dakota. But again, this was a pretty high impact event for this early in the season. Frost depth, this map here on the left is showing frost depth measurements at different NOAA co-op stations that have soil frost tube measurements at the stations. These measurements are the most recent ones that were collected anywhere from December 1st through 4th. So prior to that snow, most of that snow that we got, we see we don't really have much deep soil frost yet, maybe just in the top couple inches of soil. And with the snow on the ground, with some of these really cold temperatures that we're dealing with right now, that soil frost depth might not increase by as much as we would expect if there wasn't that snow on the ground. So now I want to turn to outlooks, and this map here that I have on this slide is the current 7-day precipitation outlook. This is going out, I pulled this morning. This is going towards 12Z, or in other words, 6 a.m. for out to December 11th, next week, Thursday. This is showing, and I will say we're getting into the time of year where this is the driest time of year across the board for most folks. Winter is climatologically our driest season. So these totals might seem pretty low to like what we're seeing further south, but one, a lot of this is going to fall as snow, and this is kind of right in the ballpark of what we would expect for this time of year, anywhere across the I-29 corridor of about quarter to a half inch. But again, that's the equivalent if we melted down the snow. So if we get a couple inches of snow, we melt that down, we might only have a few tenths of an inch. So that's kind of what we're looking at over the next 7 days. I do want to touch on El Nino, La Nina, sometimes referred to as ENSO, and what our current status is on that. The graphic here on the left is a couple different models showing sea surface temperatures in the Pacific Ocean, which which I will talk about in a minute, does have an effect on our weather. And that's kind of how those sea surface temperatures are how we determine if we're in a El Nino or La Nina period. Right now, what we're seeing, so these letters here on the bottom are just abbreviations for 3-month periods. So for example, OND is October, November, December, NDJ, November, December, January, so on and so forth. So what we're seeing here in both of these graphics is that, well, we'll start with the one on the left, is that those sea surface temperatures are, the models are pretty much converging on below normal sea surface temperatures through the middle part of winter. And what that means is that we're getting into a La Nina period, or we're currently in a La Nina period. And that is showing up here on the percent chance of El Nino La Nina graphic from NOAA on the right, where we see that currently right now, where we're sitting at in the month of December, we're in that La Nina period, but we're also in a period now where we're transitioning to more into an ENSO neutral, or those sea surface temperatures being closer to normal. And that transition is most likely kind of in the January, March period. So as we get further along in winter, more of that transition to ENSO neutral. So what does it mean to have La Nina in winter? Right now, I'd say we're kind of in a mild to moderate La Nina winter, at least a start to winter. Typically what this means, you can see here this this map here on the right, and the track of the jet stream and what that means for our climate here in the upper Midwest. Typically this means colder and wetter in Iowa and points north and west as that jet stream dips down south of us. And so north of that jet stream is going to be a much colder air mass compared to what's below it. So as that jet stream goes further south, the more of this Arctic air will dip down into our area. And there's more variability in that jet stream as well. And that's where a lot of our storm systems track. So that can mean a lot of, again, some flip-flopping from between conditions in a short amount of time. I now want to move into the CPC's outlooks of the Climate Prediction Center. These are the outlooks from NOAA that we rely on to tell us kind of what the next few weeks to months are going to bring. Before I get into that, I just want to show this graphic that kind of at least helps me interpret these maps a little bit better. When you see these maps, you can see these maps show like what is the probability that we're going to be above, near, or below normal temperatures and precipitation. But what does that exactly mean compared to like if we look at like what category your area falls into? So, you know, these maps are not showing like how much above normal, how much below normal you're going to be. It's the probability that you're going to be above, near, or below normal. So for example, if we look at a situation where we're 70 to 80% chance warmer than normal, so kind of this reddish orange color, there's a high probability that we're going to be warmer than normal. But again, it's not non-zero. There's not a non-zero probability that we're going to be near or below. So even in a situation where it's very likely we're going to be warmer than normal, there's still a probability, a meaningful amount of probability that we're going to be near or below normal. And that it becomes kind of more equal the further towards the middle you get on this graphic. So in a situation where even if you're leaning just a little bit one way or the other, there's still a pretty strong probability you could be near or below normal. So again, it's kind of the pendulum just swings one way or the other, and this map is kind of showing you which way the probabilities are leaning and how strongly they're leaning. I hope that all makes sense. So just to kind of that leads me into the actual maps now, the actual outlooks. This is the 8 to 14 day outlook. So December 11th through the 17th, right in the heart of December. What we're seeing here is a strong lean towards below normal temperatures for most of the area, most of the upper Midwest, a little bit less or so as you get further west and south. Those are areas that are more likely to be nearer to normal. So again, referring back to our graphic, it's not saying it's a slam dunk that we're gonna have below normal temperatures. That's just kind of the way the probabilities are leaning right now, and it's a stronger lean in that below normal direction. The lean's not as strong with precipitation. See most of the area here is shaded in light green, was near normal the further south that you get. So again, there's maybe a little bit of a lean towards above normal, but it's kind of a wash with those areas, mostly areas near normal. Seasonal outlook. So these come out once a month. The most recent one for December, January, February came out back on November 20th. And if you remember back to that graphic that I showed, what a typical La Nina winter looks like, we're seeing those conditions show up in the CPC maps with a lean towards below normal temperatures across a lot of the I-29 region, more so as you get to the points further north and west, with a slight lean towards above normal precipitation. And now we're seeing equal chances further down to the south in parts of western Iowa, southern South Dakota. And those are areas we really can't say with a whole lot of confidence which way it's going to go. It's kind of even Steven between above, near, and below. So can't really say with a whole lot of confidence what precipitation is going to be in those areas shaded in white. And for first look at the spring outlooks, this is March, April, May. This also came out on November 20th. No strong indications right now of a lean real one way or the other for temperatures or precipitation. There is a little bit of a slight lean towards below normal temperatures, more so in North Dakota and points nearby. And for most of the region, equal chances for precipitation, with the further east that you get, more of a lean towards above normal. So right now, not a lot of strong indication one way or the other, but I will put a caveat on this. You know, the further out you get from a time period like this, the smaller the target that you're trying to aim at. So these forecasts can change a lot as we get closer to that period. So I would just think of this as kind of a sneak preview or a first look at what spring 2026 could look like. And I want to wrap up here with quick look at how drought could change over this winter. Like I said, winter tends to be our climatologically driest time of the year compared to the other 3 seasons. So we don't expect a lot of change in drought during the winter months, and we need this snow to melt and percolate into the soil for those soil moisture levels to replenish. So if we have a good snowpack, a lot of the change might not come until the spring. But what we're seeing here in the region, in some of those areas further to the east where there was a little bit higher chance of above normal precipitation, that there could be some drought improvement or removal. But in a lot of the I-29 region where we're focusing tonight, those little areas that we have left of drought, we're not expecting a lot of change over the next 3 months in that drought. So stay tuned as we get into the spring months to see how those change. So with that, that's all I have tonight. Be happy to take any questions or comments that you have.
Very good. Thank you, Josh. Appreciate that. Again, we're a fairly small group. If you have questions, go ahead and unmute, and we'll take them live and unfiltered, so to speak. I do have one to start. And being an old man, I always say our weather's getting windier. And I hear that that's not true, but it sure seems like we're getting a lot more high wind days than I remember as a kid. Is that BS, or is there some significance there?
Yeah, that's a question I've gotten quite a bit, Fred, especially this past spring. That was a common question across Wisconsin. And the answer is we really don't have the data to say one way or the other. A lot of our measured wind data is coming from airport stations, which are kind of spread out, pretty sporadic, and the measurements have changed over the years. So we really don't have good data to say one way or the other. In terms of like strong wind events, like we could get from a thunderstorm, that kind of thing. If we're, trending warmer, wetter over time during the summer months, we may have more days where, we could have an environment that's ripe for severe thunderstorms with strong winds, but it's kind of a crapshoot, where those storms are actually going to hit and who's going to get impacted by those. So I guess the answer is, you know, really don't have good data to say one way or the other.
Okay, I'm going to shift gears and ask Dr. Roberts a question. You mentioned that when we remove the crop from above ground, uh, do we do roots compensate for what we remove above ground, especially in a typical forage crops?
Um, do you mean whether they compensate as far as their contribution to the microbe or to the organic matter in the soil?
Yeah, organic matter is what I was thinking specific. I mean, back in the day when we just cut corn for grain, we always had a lot of litter on top. Now we don't have that, at least in our area, because we're making silage and hay. Uh, do the roots play a significant role in that organic matter?
They will, to a degree, in the lower profiles in the soil. Oftentimes, what will happen, especially in like a grass hay crop, is that when you cut that, there's a lot of root sloughing that goes on as the plant is going to pull those carbohydrates from the roots to put that energy towards new regrowth. And so you will have some root sloughing that goes on, and the microbes pick up some of that, what would be lignified tissue inside the soil. Um, when I talk about the biomass of the plant matter above ground, really what I'm getting at is that there is that on the surface of the soil. If that is not protected by some type of organic material like some dead plant matter, then you don't have very much opportunity for good aggregation at the soil surface. And that's a big issue when we start talking about water and its ability to infiltrate the soil. And so that's really like usually that's my first concern when I'm trying to improve the soil, improve its structure, is getting the surface of the soil to the point, especially, here where we have our heavier soil types or our silty soil types. Not so much with the sands because they accept water readily, but in the silty and clay soil types, um, you have a difficulty getting the water to actually go into the soil. Not so much that you can hold the water better, but that you just have a hard time getting it down into the soil, especially in significant rain events that drop a lot of precipitation in a short period of time. And so I guess the what what I'm trying to point towards there is that that litter on the soil surface is crucial to improving the soil structure at the surface level so that we can accept more moisture into the soil.
Very good. John asked a question. Net wrap stores bales well, but many folks just feed or grind the hay without removing the wrap. Can that result in plastic moving through the cow to the manure and hauled on to farmland? And is this a concern? Denise, this is kind of right up your alley.
Yeah, so if you aren't removing that, it does accumulate in the rumen, and we've had a few studies as well as some producers who have tracked those, particularly feedlot cattle, but cows would be the same way, into the processing plants and pull out big balls of net wrap. So it is an issue. Um, Most of that, I think, at least those studies was looking at where they're grinding it and not pulling it off before grinding. We have had some situations also where cows will just start chewing on net wrap as it's on a bale, and they can't ever chew it off or bite it off, so they just keep chewing and chewing and chewing, and um, it usually doesn't end good for those cows. So yeah, it is a problem.
Yeah, I have a comment, Fred. A number of years ago, I coached a youth project bowl team, and we had a farmer that had a real poor doing heifer. And so we euthanized it and we did a complete autopsy. It was kind of fun for the kids for body parts. We cut the rumen open. It was full of, this was about a 500, 600 pound calf. It was full of net wrap. So it doesn't go through them. I mean, if they eat it, it'll stay in that, unless it's little pieces. But I wonder just how often that happens. But in that particular situation, that's why that calf didn't do well. Her rumen was full of net wrap.
I think with our increasing awareness of animal welfare, I, this is becoming an issue because we can no longer pass that through the system. Well, that's a Packers issue. It really isn't. And I think both of you have kind of pointed out that once it's in the cow, it doesn't go away. That's
Could I add a little to the conversation here?
absolutely.
Yeah, so this happens with a lot of substances like net wrap. It's a plastic material, but also with some of the other quality anti-quality factors, I guess you would call them, where you have ash. And really what all of those do is it fills the rumen, ash, which would be basically dirt on the forage, or in this case, the net wrap. And it really is going to hinder the animal's ability to perform, because that's a percentage of the rumen that can no longer hold forage. And that's a big issue. If you want to maximize your animal performance, you can't have any of that junk laying around in the rumen. So yeah, whether it's ash or whether it's net wrap, whatever, trying to keep all of that stuff out is something that you should strive for.
Denise's story about it, they couldn't bite it off, the net wraps, they just kept chewing. I used to, back when I was a young man, would help the local veterinarian, and we did a necropsy on a cow and opened the rumen up. And there was a ball that when we finally got it stretched of the old 1.5 inch hay rope was almost 30 foot long. I mean, she just couldn't bite it off and kept chewing it. And ultimately, that's what made her a bad doer and a dead cow. But you uh, uh, you had mentioned that in your one couple of your grazing slides, uh, the performance issues. What species were you grazing? In Missouri, was it only fescue, or were you grazing other grasses or legumes?
Yeah, so most of what I do work here is fescue, tall fescue pasture. Yep. So I'm trying to remember back on which one I might be referring that you might be talking about. But yeah, pretty much all of my research is done on tall fescue. The research, particularly when we're comparing hay versus a grazing system, yeah, that's all tall fescue based, with maybe some legumes in the mix. Um, but yeah, usually just some stalker type animals.
Good. Anyone? Go ahead and unmute. I'm going to throw a question at Jim. Have you had any of the cornstalk bales tested this year?
Me, no, I have not seen any. So that's a good question. I mean, there's been there actually was somebody that tested. I can't remember what they found, other than it was really dry, and they found more. The cattle weren't eating it, And so they were going to test for some molds and mycotoxin kind of issues. I don't know. Have you guys seen that? That's a good question because of a wet growing year, but usually that grows in the fall. But have you seen that in your areas where they think it's just from the growing season that it's not very palatable for these beef cows?
I haven't seen any tests come back yet, but I know at least in eastern Iowa, northeast Iowa, we had such a infestation of southern leaf rust, and there were some concerns as to what that was going to do to our corn stalks and corn stalk bales. I think from our forage agronomist perspective, her comments were it's not a toxicity issue, but
Right.
it probably will deteriorate much quicker than normal, probably more fiber content, higher fiber content, lower digestible nutrients, um, palatability kinds of issues. But I haven't seen any results back.
Yeah, this was more of a palatability issue. They weren't having sick animals or anything, but they just weren't eating it, what they had expected.
Where I was going is, for many years we always said stocks are 6 to 6.5% protein. In the last 2 years, seeing a lot of stocks come in at 8 or a little over 8. And I think there's some genetics playing a role in there. Maybe they are cleaner and don't have as many of the funguses in them, but it makes a difference when you're whether balancing a ration for a pregnant cow or a cow, you're using that in the grinder ration. And I was just curious what you're seeing. I've seen two samples come in over 8.
Fred, my question I'm sure some of it is the genetics of the corn plant, but looking at how many guys are using fungicides now, I mean, we're out combining corn and it's green. It's,
Yep.
18% moisture and the stalk is still green or the leaves are green. So where does that factor into that as well?
Yeah. I don't have the answer to that. I just know for many years it was a stock answer, 6%. And I think that's definitely changing. And in January, we will hear uh, one of our lab people from the laboratories tell us what they're seeing. So we're kind of excited about that. Any other questions coming in? Otherwise, well, I thank you to our presenters for the information, and I remind everybody that the link to the evaluation for this program is in the chat box. It takes about a week to archive this program, so I will send a link to everybody who registered with that URL link. Plus, it will have the evaluation link for that. The 2026 Forage webinar starts on January 7th with Dr. Young sharing information on virtual fencing. Dr. Shelby Gress will be discussing winter grazing, and we'll have hay and forage editor Amber Fredrickson giving us a market outlook. Thank you very much and enjoy the rest of your evening.